requesting backup.
March 1939, at the Big Horn Basin in northwest Wyoming. Winter is hanging on the way that it always does up here. Snow still deep in the timber, the Absarokas locked in ice, families in Cody and Powell stretching what's left of the Depression years across one more cold month. And over the course of 11 days, this quiet corner of Wyoming becomes the center of the biggest manhunt in the state's history. Before it's over, 4 law enforcement officers will be dead. A young civilian will lose his life. The Wyoming National Guard will roll howitzers up a mountain road. Airplanes will drop explosives on a granite hillside. And newspapers from New York to Los Angeles will print a name most of America has never even heard before: Earl Durand. The national press call him the Tarzan of the Tetons. Never mind that the Tetons are 100 miles from where any of this happened. Here in the basin, we just call him Earl. And here's the thing almost every retelling gets wrong. This story doesn't begin with a jailbreak. It doesn't begin with a gunfight or a mountain siege or a bank robbery. It begins on a dark highway west of Cody with a truck, a roadblock, and 4 elk. Welcome back, listeners, to Dark Dialogue Rocky Mountain Reckoning. This is Season 2, Hunted and Cornered, the series where we follow the pursuits of accountability across the Rocky Mountain West, where every investigation begins with victims, every pursuit is shaped by the land, and every decision narrows the path toward a final reckoning. I'm your host, John.
And I'm your co-host, Angela. Together we examine the crimes that continue to echo across the mountains, forests, deserts, highways, and small towns of the West. Through evidence, through timelines, through careful investigation, and through the stories of those whose lives were forever changed. Because the pursuit is never the destination, the victims are. This is Season 2, Hunted and Cornered. All season long, we'll follow one question through some of the most consequential pursuits in the history of the Rocky Mountain West. Can anyone truly outrun accountability?
Some of the people that we'll talk about this season ran for hours. Some ran for years. Some surrendered quietly, and some forced the kind of confrontation that nobody walks away from. But every one of these stories starts the same place, with the victims, with lives that were already shattered before the first roadblock ever went up.
And that's where we're going to keep our focus. The pursuit is the path. It's never the destination. We're opening the season with a 3-episode arc, 11 Days in March of 1939, Earl Durand. And I want to start with something you said when we were planning the season, that of every case on the board, this was the one you felt you had to do. So why this story?
Because I didn't find this story in any kind of an archive. I grew up with it. We both grew up in Cody, and one of my earliest memories, and I mean early.
Very early.
I was just a little kid, and I was sitting with my dad in the small theater that they have in the basement of the Buffalo Bills Center of the West.
Which was the historical center at the time.
Yes. And we were watching an old silent film about Earl Durand, flickering black and white, no sound but the projector, and this story unfolding that everybody else in the room already seemed to know.
So this wasn't something you had to go looking for.
No. And in the Big Horn Basin, you don't really go looking for Earl Durand. He finds you. This story got told around dinner tables, hunting camps, coffee shops in Powell, ranch kitchens out towards Clark. My dad actually knew Tip Cox, who was the 17-year-old kid who shot Earl during the bank robbery in Powell. We'll get to Tip later in this arc, but that's how close this history sits right at the surface here. It's just a handshake away.
For listeners outside Wyoming, though, Earl Durand is basically unknown. This was a national story in 1939, front pages across the country, and then it just faded.
Outside the state, yeah. Inside the basin, it never really faded. It changed, though. And that's really why we're doing this. Over nearly 90 years, this story got retold through newspapers, books, 2 Hollywood movies, songs, documentaries, and thousands of local retellings. And somewhere along the way, the legend and the history stopped being the same story. Some of what gets passed down is accurate. Some of it has grown in the retelling. Mm-hmm. And honestly, in some places, we can't fully tell anymore where the record ends and the folklore begins.
So that's the job, this arc, to separate the two.
That's the job. And here's how I'll do it. When something is established fact, like court records, contemporary reporting, the historical record, I'll tell you. When it's a reasonable inference, I'll tell you that too.
You always do.
And when it's legend or speculation or just something that I heard in a coffee shop growing up, well, I'm going to call it exactly that. There are questions in this story that we can't answer, and we're not going to pretend otherwise.
And one more thing before we start, because it matters. This episode is mostly about Earl, who he was, where he came from, how a respected neighbor ended up on the wrong side of the roadblock. But this story has victims, 5 of them, and this show exists for them, not for the legend.
We'll be introducing the first 2 of those men at the end of tonight's episode, and I'll ask you to stay for that. It's the most important part of this episode. Okay, so let's start where you have to start, with the man himself. Who was Walter Earl Durand before he became one of Wyoming's most infamous fugitives? And Angela, are you familiar with this story? I know that you are now that I've brought it to the podcast, but
a little bit and more often because when you brought it up, it sounded familiar and I couldn't quite figure out why. And then I sought it out. I found one video. You told me I wasn't going to find anything. You were right. I found one video and I'm listening to it. And all of a sudden I hear my boss's name.
Oh, yeah.
And so I sent it to him. And the reason, I don't know if you heard me laugh when you said people don't seek out Earl Durand. I laughed because my boss sought him out for 3 hours
at the cemetery,
right? Looking for his grave. So it tickled me when you said no one seeks him out, because one person does.
Yeah.
But so I didn't know too much of this. Like, my family didn't really talk too much about it. What I am going to say, though, is more of the stories that I heard growing up in history were in Utah. Like, I don't know why the Wyoming family didn't care, but Utah, I know a lot about Utah.
Well, and I think, too, a lot of, and I really never realized this until I was researching it, but a lot of this, people just don't know because it was so long ago.
Yeah.
And, my parents are older than most parents of kids in my generation. Right. So my dad's...
Well, you're the youngest.
I'm the youngest. My dad will turn 90 this year. They've lived out here for ages, and he knew people involved in this story. Mm-hmm. And I mean, he was alive when this happened, but he was only like 3 years old. But still, it's just more relevant, I think, to that generation. And
my boss cares because he has family who are involved in the story too.
Yeah.
So,
and Earl Durand's relation still is in the area. I know some of them that live out in Clark. Yeah. So
they still put flowers on his grave, which is why the boss man had a hard time finding it, because he didn't expect anybody to be putting flowers on it still.
Yeah. So Walter Earl Durand is born January the 9th, 1913 in Missouri. And his parents, Walter and Effie Durand, are farmers. And in 1918, the family moves west to Powell, Wyoming. Powell's up in the northeast corner of the Big Horn Basin. Earl grows up there with 3 sisters doing what farm kids did: gardening, milking, field work. A completely ordinary start, and that's worth sitting with for a second, because the legend wants Earl to arrive fully formed. This wild figure who walked out of the mountains one day. Well, he didn't. He was a farm kid from Powell. But 2 threads show up early that matter for everything that's going to follow. The first is books. Earl was a voracious reader. History, wildlife, woodcraft, camping, Western pulp novels, and the Bible. Family accounts say that he read it cover to cover 5 times and carried a small Bible that his Aunt Emily had given him. He leaves school after the 8th grade, which might sound shocking now, but it was completely normal for...
That was a long time back in the day.
Yeah, I mean,
grade?
you're talking about, a boy in rural Wyoming in the 1920s. Leaving school at 8th grade was normal, and then you went to work. Now, what's less normal is what Earl did with his self-education. He wasn't reading to pass the time. He was reading, near as we can tell, to build a worldview, history, the frontier, men who lived off the land. He was studying a Wyoming that was already disappearing. The second thread is the outdoors. From a very early age, Earl doesn't just enjoy the backcountry, he moves into it. As a young man, he sets up a wall tent behind his parents' house.
He becomes it.
And he lives in it. He didn't live in the house. He lived in the tent year round. And he starts disappearing into the Absarokas and the Beartooths for weeks at a time, alone, trapping, hunting, refining his skills. And if you've seen those mountains, you know that that's not just camping. It is survival at an expert level. Mm-hmm. They're some of the most rugged mountains I've ever seen. Now,
so was it strange for him to want to live in a tent back then?
Probably not. It wouldn't be near as unusual as now, but...
That's true. Now I would think somebody was little...
I don't know. I mean, I had a buddy that unfortunately passed away, but he lived in a wall tent because he was taking every penny he had to pay for college. And so he lived in a wall tent up until his death. He was living in a wall tent.
Just more comfortable that way?
Yeah, and it was cheap. It was, so... And
okay.
you have a little stove in there. You can cook and keep it warm. And so a wall tent's not like a tent that you get at Walmart or whatever. I mean, it's a large canvas tent that you can have a stove in and heat.
But nobody back in the day thought Earl was weird for...
Not that I could find, really. Okay. No. But this is where I have to be careful because we've just crossed into the part of Earl's story where fact and legend really start braiding together. So let me try to separate them. Here's what's well established. Earl was physically enormous for the era. 6'2",
right,
and around 250 pounds. And by every contemporary account, extraordinarily strong and fit. He was an expert hunter, trapper, and outdoorsman, and that is not folklore. Multiple contemporary sources describe him as a genuine woodsman, not somebody that was playing at it. He ran daily. He hunted with a rifle, and then when that got too easy, he took up a bow and arrow. Neighbors and employers considered his stamina almost unbelievable. And then there's the legend. The legend says that he could shoot 4 rifle bullets through a thrown baseball before it hit the ground. The legend says that he could run 40 miles in a night at a lope, that he shot the centers out of milk cans while a friend held them at arm's length, that at 19, crossing the Mojave Desert, he nearly died and survived by killing a wildcat and eating it raw. How much of this do I buy? Well, here's my honest answer. I can't verify any of those specific stories, and neither can the historians who've worked this case deeper than I have. The baseball story in particular reads like a frontier tall tale.
Dime Novel magazine.
Yeah, physics has opinions about that one. What I can tell you is that the stories are old. They weren't invented after 1939 to sell newspapers. Locals were telling them before Earl ever became famous. And exaggerated stories usually grow around some kind of a real seed. The reasonable inference is that Earl's marksmanship and his endurance were genuinely exceptional. Exceptional enough that people reached for impossible stories to describe them. But those specific feats, they're legend until proven otherwise.
People were already making him famous for good things.
Right. I mean, he was an impressive dude. No doubt about it. The desert story gets repeated everywhere. along with accounts of Earl eating raw meat generally. There's one about him cutting the tenderloin out of a beef and gnawing it raw. And I'd put those in the same category, widely reported, probably rooted in something real and impossible to verify. And
but
that's
not impossible to believe because people do that.
Oh yeah, it's not impossible to believe at all.
Yeah.
But it's important because it's exactly the kind of detail that the national press would later weaponize when they wanted to paint him as a savage.
Of course.
The Tarzan branding didn't come from nowhere. It came from stories like that. And one more thing about young Earl, because it matters, he traveled. As a young man, he rides a saddle horse south, intending to make it to Mexico. Along the way, he's thrown in jail twice. Accounts say on suspicion of vagrancy in the Southwest, and then he was released without charges. He spends time in the Mojave. Later, he fights forest fires in Oregon. So Earl has seen the wider world. And then he came home. Every time back to Powell, back to the tent, back to the Absarokas. And if you watch Longmire, it's Absarokas. If you live in Wyoming, it's the Absarokas. So, but whatever he saw out there, he chose this. That's not a man who was trapped in the Big Horn Basin. That's a man who was anchored to it. People eventually called him the last mountain man, and it's tempting to hear that as marketing, a nickname that somebody stuck on him after the fact, but it wasn't. It's both a description and a symbol. A description because Earl genuinely lived closer to the 1830s than the 1930s. He wasn't performing frontier life for anybody. There was no audience in a wall tent in January in Wyoming. But it's also a symbol, and here's the context that you need. Northwest Wyoming in Earl's lifetime is changing fast. Cars, radios, modern law enforcement, government agencies. Powell itself only exists because of a federal irrigation project. The town literally began as a work camp for men digging ditches. The frontier is closing in real time, within living memory. And in the middle of all that, here's this young man living like the mountain man out of the history books that he grew up reading. When neighbors looked at Earl, I think a lot of them were seeing something that they'd already lost.
Makes me want to sing the Davy Crockett song.
Kind of does. And that goes a long way toward explaining the question that stops people when they first hear this story, because this man was admired, genuinely, widely admired, and not from a distance. People knew him. They liked him, fed him at their tables. So if Earl Durand was so respected by his neighbors, why did he spend so much of his life in conflict with the law? A lot of people assume that nobody had heard of Earl Durand until the manhunt, that he was some anonymous hermit who exploded into the headlines. That's one of the biggest misconceptions in this whole story, because by March of 1939, Earl is already a well-known figure across the Big Horn Basin, and to a lot of people, a very well-liked one. If you don't understand that, nothing about how this region reacted to what came later makes any kind of sense. So let me build a picture. First, the man was a worker. Farmers and ranchers around Powell actively sought Earl out for hire because by every account, he could flat outwork anybody. Shuck corn all day, buck bells, endless stamina. In an agricultural community, that reputation is currency. And here's the paradox of Earl. He chose solitude, but he wasn't a recluse. He visited neighbors constantly. He even had a signature. He walked up to the house and tapped the butt of his rifle against the door 3 times. 3 taps, and everybody knew that Earl was calling. And I love that detail. He used his rifle as a doorbell.
Yeah.
But hold on to that feeling, because that's the whole tension of this man in one image. The rifle was simply part of Earl, as ordinary to him as a hat. His neighbors read those 3 taps as friendly, and for years, they were right to. But here's the piece that made Earl more than just a likable hired hand. It's the 1930s. The Depression has hit rural Wyoming hard. Families in Park County are genuinely struggling. Farm prices collapsed, cash is scarce, and by late winter, there are households that are simply hungry. And into that walks a man who can reliably take an elk anytime he wants and gives the meat away. Mm-hmm. This is the Robin Hood reputation. And I want to be precise about what's documented because this part of the legend gets both overstated and unfairly dismissed. The core of it is confirmed. Earl routinely poached elk and deer and shared the meat with struggling families and widows. Jared Metz, the historian who did the deepest work on this case and who interviewed 15 firsthand participants, documents this pattern directly. In fact, Metz says that the specific hunt that starts our story, the one that we'll get to in a few minutes, was at least in part about getting elk meat to a widow and her children who needed food. That's not the legend being kind to him. That's what the people who were there said, and they said it consistently. And what we can't reconstruct is scale. How often did he do this? How many families? Is every Robin Hood story that got handed down true, or have decades of retelling grown his generosity the way that they grew his marksmanship? We just don't know. That's an honest unknown. Brian Bavis, the Park County archivist, makes the point that even today, some people in the basin still see Earl as the Robin Hood who fed the poor, and others see him as a stain on Wyoming. 90 years on, this community still has not settled that question. Now, I can feel this story tilting towards something, and I'm not going to let it tilt there uncritically. Everything I've just described is charming. The 3 taps, feeding the widows, and this is a man who is going to kill 4 people. So am I polishing him? No. And this is exactly where retellings of Earl Durand go wrong, in one direction or in the other. So let me deliberately unpolish him. Fact 1, sharing the meat did not make it legal. Every elk was poached. Wyoming game laws existed for real reasons. We'll get into that in a minute, and Earl broke them constantly and knowingly for years. Mm-hmm. This wasn't one hungry winter. It was a way of life for him. Fact 2, the legend conveniently forgets this one. The meat wasn't all charity. Earl fed himself off those animals too. The Robin Hood framing wants pure altruism. The record shows a man serving his neighbors and himself. In fact 3, Metz is blunt that Earl was, in his words, a minor criminal well before 1939. He was known to break into unoccupied cabins and take things that caught his eye. Knives, rifles, add the vagrancy arrest from his travels, add years of run-ins with game wardens. None of it violent. That matters. There's no record of Earl raising a hand against a person before 1939, but the clean version of Earl, the gentle giant who only ever bent the rules to feed the hungry, that man just did not exist. So the honest version is this: both. He genuinely helped people who were desperate, and he was genuinely a habitual lawbreaker who took what he wanted, both at the same time. And I'd ask you to resist resolving that because the people of the basin couldn't do it, and they knew him.
Right.
The Depression scrambled a lot of moral math out here. When your neighbor's kids are hungry and a man shows up at the door with 50 pounds of elk meat, very few people in Powell in 1937 were asking to see his license.
Right.
That doesn't make it right, but it does make it human.
Legally.
Yeah. And it explains something crucial for everything that's going to follow. When this story turned violent, a lot of people in this basin experienced it not as a criminal getting cornered. They experienced it as a friend going somewhere that they couldn't follow. That's going to color everything about the manhunt, the posse, the crowds, the aftermath, all of it, shaped by the fact that half the county had eaten Earl Durand's elk meat.
Yeah. As if he was accepting the consequences for them, for their rights.
And something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's admired, he's generous, he's useful, and he is constantly crossing Wyoming's game wardens. That's the collision that we have to understand next, because I keep saying this was never about one elk. So what was it actually about? To answer that, we have to back up about 50 years, because the fight between Earl Durand and the game wardens did not start in 1939. It started well before Earl was even born. In the late 1800s, Wyoming wildlife nearly disappeared. That's not rhetoric. Unrestricted market hunting came close to wiping out the herds. Elk, deer, antelope, pretty well wiped out the buffalo. They were killed at an industrial scale, shipped east as meat and hides. No seasons, no limits, no oversight. So by the turn of the century, it was obvious to almost everyone that without some kind of intervention, the game would simply be gone. So conservation wasn't government overreach necessarily looking for a problem. It was a response to a genuine collapse. Starting in the early 1900s, Wyoming, like states across the West, built the modern system. Hunting licenses, seasons, bag limits, protected areas, and a new kind of lawman to enforce all of it, the game warden. And I want to say this plainly because this show is not going to characterize these men. The wardens in this story are enforcing laws that existed to make sure that there would still be elk in the Absarokas for the next generation. And those laws worked, by the way. The wildlife that we have in Wyoming today exists because of that system. But if you're Earl, and honestly, if you're a lot of older hunters in the basin at the time, the world just changed the rules on you mid-game. These are men who spent their whole lives hunting when their family needed meat.
Yeah.
Nobody asked permission. Hunting wasn't recreation, and it certainly wasn't a licensed privilege.
Or a lottery to be won.
Yes, or a lottery to be won.
Does that make you mad?
No, I mean, I agree. I agree with most of the game laws that we have. I mean, we cannot all just go out and kill every animal that we want to kill anytime we want to kill it. We just can't.
Yeah.
Because there would be none.
All in the same place.
The game laws have to exist. And I think that the way that they do it, honestly, is probably as fair as they can. They have a draw. You put in, maybe you get it, maybe you don't. There's general licenses and stuff too. So, but for this generation of people, and my dad is part of this generation. My grandpa was definitely part of it.
They watched the law change and was like, what?
Hunting for them was never recreation. My dad hated hunting because he had to hunt for such a huge part of his life that he did not enjoy hunting. It was a job. It was a job.
A chore.
And it definitely wasn't something that you wanted to go pay money in order to be able to go do.
Right.
It was just how you lived. And now there's a man with a badge telling you that the elk belong to the government and that you need to buy a piece of paper and wait for a season and stop at some arbitrary limit. And to men like Earl, the government...
In specific places.
In specific places, yeah. And to men like Earl, the government hadn't created hunting. The government had inserted itself into something that had always belonged to the people. Now, that might sound sympathetic, and I'm not trying to be sympathetic. I'm trying to be accurate, which is different. Today's Wyoming hunters, myself included, grew up in this system. You buy your license, you apply for tags, you might wait years to draw a certain area, and that feels normal because it is normal now. But it wasn't handed down from the mountain. It was built within living memory of the people in this story. Understanding why Earl believed that he wasn't morally wrong is not the same as saying that he was legally right. He wasn't. The law was clear and he broke it constantly. And I mean constantly. He flatly refused to buy a hunting license ever on principle alone. He hunted whenever he needed to or wanted to, in season or out. He ignored bag limits, though by some accounts he held to his own private rule of one carcass per man, which tells you something interesting. This wasn't a man without a code. It was a man who answered to his own code instead of to the state's code. And when you operate like that for years in country patrolled by wardens, you're going to meet those wardens. Reportedly, two of them matter to our story. Game wardens King and Kennedy. They'd crossed paths with Earl before 1939, so they knew exactly who he was. And in their book, he was a chronic repeat offender. In his own book, he was a free man being harassed for feeding people.
Right.
There's a question we're sitting with here for a second. There's a version of this that's almost civil disobedience, a man openly refusing a law that he believes is unjust. And then there's the version that's just a guy who doesn't want to follow the rules. So which was Earl? Honestly, the evidence supports the conflict better than it supports the philosophy. Mm-hmm. What's very strongly documented by court records and newspapers from the time is the pattern. Years of deliberate violations, openly, without apology. What Earl believed inside is a hell of a lot harder to say. He never wrote any kind of a manifesto, but the shape of his life is an argument. The tent instead of the house, the mountains instead of town, the refusal to buy the license even when a license was cheap and he had the money from working on local ranches. The reasonable inference is that Earl's poaching wasn't a habit that he couldn't break. It was a world that he would not leave. A man out of time. That's exactly what he was, and that's why this was never about an elk. What's actually colliding here is two visions of Wyoming. One looks forward, conservation, regulation, the modern state, wildlife preserved for the future, and the other looks back to a frontier where a man hunted because his family or his neighbors needed food, and they answered to nobody for that. And both visions had real things to say for themselves, but only one of them had the law behind it. And for years, that collision stayed cold. Citations, run-ins, a known poacher, and the wardens who knew him. It simmered like that for a long time. And then on Monday, March 13th, 1939, up the North Fork of the Shoshone River, it stopped simmering. So let's go there. Let's walk through the day that set the last 11 days of Earl Durand's life in motion. And I'll warn you in advance how this is going to feel. It's going to feel ordinary. That's the point. Monday, March 13th, 1939, before we move a single person around on the board, I want you to feel what late winter meant in the Big Horn Basin that year. By March, winter has taken its toll on everybody. The depression is still grinding. Game is lean. Money is scarcer. And there are families who have been stretching food for months. Late season elk in that world isn't sport. It's meat. It's sustenance. Right. So when Earl Durand climbs into a truck that day, in his mind, near as we can reconstruct it, he's doing what he's done 100 times, going to get meat that somebody needs. And according to Metz's research, at least part of the intent was elk meat for a widow and her children. Earl has no reason to believe this day is different from any other hunt of the last decade. There are 3 others with him, a man named Gus Knopp and 2 teenage boys. And that last detail should stop you the way that it stops me. 2 teenagers. Hold on to them because those boys are about to be standing in a roadblock in the dark. The group drives west out of Cody, up the North Fork of the Shoshone River. That's the drainage running away from the east gate of Yellowstone. Big winter range, and in March, it's holding elk. At some point that day, the party kills 4 elk. Out of season, no licenses, certainly not for Earl.
Right.
Do we know who shot what? We don't. And I want to flag that as a genuine unknown. 4 elk, 4 hunters, and the record doesn't tell us who fired which shots. What the record does tell us is what happens next. Somebody sees something. A local resident notices suspicious activity and reports it. And that tip goes to the 2 men who need no introduction to Earl Durand, game wardens King and Kennedy, the same 2 wardens who'd been dealing with Earl for years. They don't go charging into the timber after armed men. They do the smart thing, the patient thing. They set up a roadblock on the road out because whatever happens up that drainage, the truck has to come back down. It's dark by the time it does. The truck comes down the North Fork Road and it rolls up on the roadblock. And right here, right at this moment, the entire history of the Big Horn Basin forks because as the truck slows for the wardens, the passenger door opens. Earl Durand steps out into the dark carrying his rifle, and he simply vanishes. Off the road, into the night, into the country that he knows better than any man alive. No confrontation, no shots, no violence at all that night. The wardens detain everyone else. Knopf, the two boys, the truck, the evidence of all 4 illegal elk. By the standards of a game warden's career, this is a successful stop. Almost routine. One suspect fled, sure, but everybody in the country knows Earl Durand. It's not like he can hide his identity. And I want to freeze us right here because to every single person standing on that road, the wardens, Knopf, the two boys, Earl himself out there in the dark, this is a poaching case, a serious one for elk, but a poaching case. Nobody standing on that highway could have imagined that within 2 weeks, 4 law enforcement officers would be dead. A civilian would be dead. The National Guard would be shelling a mountainside, and airplanes would be dropping explosives on the high country. We know what's coming. They didn't. So hold that gap in your mind for the rest of this series because the tragedy of this story lives inside of that. Now, the question that everybody asks, why did he run? The other 3 stayed with the truck. They took their arrest. Why does Earl jump? And here's where I have to be disciplined because the honest answer is we have no freaking clue what was in his head at the time. He never got the chance to explain it, and he may not have been able to, but here's what we can say. It is a fact that Earl had years of history with these 2 exact wardens and a deep documented hostility to the entire system that they represented. It is also a fact that he was carrying a rifle that he wasn't legally entitled to be hunting with, standing over, in effect, 4 illegal elk. Reasonable inference would be a man who had built his whole identity around never submitting to that system did, in the moment of arrest, the thing his whole life had been rehearsing. He walked away from it into the one place where the system couldn't follow him. Was it planned? Did he get in that truck already knowing that if they got stopped, he was going to run? That's unknowable. Genuinely, we can read the jump as pure instinct. The door opens and the animal in him just goes. You can read it as a standing decision that he'd made years earlier. The evidence can't split those apart, so I'm not going to pretend that I can. But here's what I can tell you. If he'd stayed in that truck, if Earl takes the arrest with the others on March 13th, then in all likelihood, you'd never have heard of Earl Durand.
Seems to end in a different way.
The other men were processed as game violations, fines, some jail time, serious but survivable. If Earl stands there and takes the handcuffs, this is a paragraph in the Powell Tribune. Instead, it's the reason that this podcast exists. He didn't stay, and overnight, alone, out there in the cold, something happens that changes the legal weight of this entire case. The next morning, a rancher in that country makes an ugly discovery. One of his animals, sources describe it as a cow in some accounts, a calf in others, and all flag that inconsistency rather than to smooth it over, but it's been shot. Part of the carcass has been butchered, meat cut and carried away, and there are fresh footprints in the snow to say who did it. Now, I need you to understand what just changed because this is the hinge of the whole legal story. The elk are game violations, a fine and county jail time, but killing a rancher's livestock in 1939 Wyoming in a cattle economy, that is a felony. a felony carrying at least up to 2 years in prison. So overnight, Earl Durand has converted a poaching case into something categorically more serious. And nearly every historical account of this case points at the livestock complaint as the moment that the stakes truly changed. Whether Earl understood that at the moment out there in the dark with a hunk of beef, we don't know, but the law understood it. Did hunger drive it? A man alone in the mountains in March with no supplies? Was he just feeding himself the only way available?
Worried how long he was going to be hiding out there?
Who knows? He only took a piece of the meat, though. He didn't take the whole thing. Yeah. But that is the most natural read, and it's probably right. He cut meat from the animal, which does tell you that it was about food. It's not out of spite or something. But notice what it also tells you. This legendary woodsman, one night out, is shooting a domestic animal with a rifle shot from a ranch house instead of living invisibly off the land. Whatever the legend says about Earl Durand, March in Wyoming is bigger than any legend. Which brings us to the question that I promise you every listener is asking now. This is the greatest outdoorsman in Wyoming, the last mountain man. He's in his home country with a rifle and a head start, so how on earth did they catch him? The answer fits in 2 words, and anyone who's spent a winter in this country already knows them. Fresh snow. That's simple. That merciless. Let me put you inside it because
it doesn't hide you at all.
Not at all. This is one place where growing up here actually helps tell this story.
Mm-hmm.
In thick timber, a man can disappear visually in about 4 steps. You can stand 30 feet from someone in the deadfall and never know it. Visibility is...
Oh, that's creepy. Yeah.
Visibility is Earl's friend, and it always has been. But fresh snow doesn't care how good you are.
No.
Every step that you take is a signed confession.
It laughs at you.
Direction of travel, length of stride, where you rested, where you turned to look back. An experienced tracker doesn't just follow prints. He reads them, and he starts predicting you. Anybody who's tracked game through Wyoming snow knows exactly how unforgiving it is. You cannot walk through fresh snow without writing your own autobiography behind you. And Earl has just written a very clear chapter next to a dead cow. Fresh tracks leaving a butchered animal heading into the Shoshone River Canyon country. So on March 14th, Wardens King and Kennedy organize a search, and it's growing into a posse. Local men who know this ground and now flip the usual story on its head because this is the part the legend hates. The Wardens run this pursuit beautifully. Patient, methodical tracking, local knowledge against local knowledge. They stay on the trail through the canyon country, and then they do the thing that decides it. They get above him. In mountain country, elevation is information. The man above sees. The man below is seen.
Mm-hmm.
Earl's entire security, his whole life, rested on one assumption, that in the backcountry, he detects you before you detect him. Every legend about Earl assumes that he's the watcher. On March 14th, for maybe the first time in his life, Earl Durand is the watched. The posse works above his position, and when the moment comes, they're simply there. He's surprised, he's disarmed, and he's taken into custody. No gunfight, no shots fired, not even, from what the record shows, much of a struggle. They got the drop on him so completely that the greatest woodsman in Wyoming just put his hands up. They bring him back into Cody to the Park County Jail alive. His total time as a fugitive is less than 24 hours. So sit with that for a second, because the legend really does not survive contact with this day. 40 miles in a night Earl, baseball Earl, caught in a day. And that's precisely why this moment matters and why I refuse to rush past it. The mythology needs Earl to be superhuman. The national press needed it in 1939, and the folklore has needed it ever since. But March 14th tells you the truth. Earl Durand was an extraordinarily skilled man, and a man. He got cold. He got hungry enough to shoot a cow within a day. He got overconfident or careless or unlucky or all three. And a couple of experienced game wardens with fresh snow and patience beat him in his own backyard. It wasn't bullets or bloodhounds that brought Earl Durand back. It was good, humble police work and weather. What was he thinking out there? Did he mean to keep running deeper into the Absarokas, north into Montana, out of the country entirely? We know nothing about those hours inside his head, and I won't invent it. We don't know whether he ever considered walking back down and turning himself in. We don't even know whether he yet understood that the livestock complaint was about to become a felony. Those hours alone in the North Fork country are a locked room. What we know is where he ended up, and that is in a cell in Cody. And now I want to mark this moment the way that it deserves to be marked, because in the whole 11-day story, this is the steel point. On the evening of March 14th, 1939, no one has been killed. Not one person. Earl is in custody. He's alive. He's unhurt. The wardens are alive. Every officer, every member of that posse went home to supper. In Powell, Marshal Chuck Lewis is going about his duties. Out in the county, Deputy D.M. Baker is doing the same. 2 teenage boys from the truck are back with their families, badly scared, but completely safe. Everyone in this story, everyone is still alive. And the system has worked exactly the way that it's supposed to work. Crime, punishment, arrest, no blood. Everything that follows was still preventable, every bit of it. And that's what makes the rest of this arc so hard to carry. The Basin on the evening of March 14th reasonably believes, that the Earl Durand matter is over. He'd been caught fair and square. In short order, he pleads guilty to the elk charges. He's fined $100 and he's sentenced to jail. Sources differ on the term. Some say 60 days, most say 6 months, and I'll flag that rather than pick a side. Either way, months, not years. A man Earl's age does that time and walks out with his whole life in front of him. But the rancher's complaint is working its way through the system. The felony, the livestock killing, the one carrying up to 2 years in prison, is still pending. It's sitting there like a stone about to drop. And Earl Durand, a man who lived in a wall tent because even a house felt too closed in, a man his own family believed couldn't tolerate confinement, is sitting in a cell in the Park County Jail, waiting to find out how much of his life the state of Wyoming intends to take. So was this the last real chance to stop what's coming? I've turned that question over my whole life, and here's the most honest answer that I have. It was the last moment when stopping it required nothing. No heroics, no perfect decisions. On March 14th, the catastrophe isn't rolling yet. It's just a man in a cell, a pending charge, and time. Everything that ignites it is still ahead, and none of it had to happen. What does happen happens inside that jail. A routine evening, a meal delivered to a cell, one disastrous decision, and out of it comes one of the most infamous manhunts in the history of the American West. We'll open that cell door next episode, but before we go tonight, I want to step back from the timeline for a few minutes because there's a bigger conversation sitting underneath everything that we just covered. All night, I've been doing this two-handed thing. Here's the legend, here's the record. And I want to spend a few minutes on the gap between them, not to debunk it, to understand it, because most crimes, even the terrible ones, fade in a generation. This one got told at my dinner table 90 years later. Why does a story like this survive? I've thought about that my whole life, and I think stories survive when a community needs them for something. The Basin didn't keep retelling the Earl Durand story because it's exciting, although it is. It kept telling it because the story holds questions the community never finished answering. What do you owe your neighbors when the law and your conscience disagree? What happens when the world changes faster than the people in it? Was Earl one of us who went wrong? or was he never who we thought he was? Every generation that retells it is quietly re-arguing those questions. And every generation reshapes the story while they do it. That's how local memory works. And I want to be fair to it because it's easy for a show like ours to stand on the documents and look down on the folklore. Local memory preserves things that the record never captured. The 3 taps on the door, that's not in any court file. Somebody's grandmother remembered that. The names of the families who ate that elk meat through the hard winters. The archive doesn't have them. The kitchens did. Some of the truest things that we know about who Earl was before 1939 survive only because people keep talking. But local memory also has no fact checker. It wants a good story more than a true one. Every retelling rounds the edges. The baseball gets one more bullet through it. The sentence that he was facing gets a little longer. The wardens get a little meaner. The meat gets a little more charitable. 90 years of that layered under 2 Hollywood movies and a national press that literally branded him Tarzan, and you get what we have now, a legend wearing history's clothes. I'll tell you what broke for me personally when I finally did the research. I grew up inside the legend. I heard these stories long before I ever read a document. And the thing the record wouldn't support wasn't Earl's competence. It was everybody else's incompetence. The story I grew up with was shaped like a Western, the wild man against the world, always one step ahead, brought down only at the end and only barely. When you read the record of March 14th and he was caught in a day, quietly by 2 game wardens doing careful, patient work, the legend has no room for that, so the legend mostly skips it. And notice what else that tells you. The thing the folklore skips is the thing that makes everyone else look good. The legend needs Earl at the center. And superhuman Earl requires an overmatched everybody else. But the record keeps showing the opposite. A citizen who reported what he had saw. 2 wardens who set a smart roadblock instead of charging into the timber, and then out-tracked the best woodsman in Wyoming. A court that handled the case inside of 48 hours without anyone getting hurt. Through March 14th, the ordinary people in this story are quietly excellent. The legend erases all of them to make room for Earl. And that erasure is exactly what this season is pushing against. Because the pursuit of accountability, the real thing, not the movie version, is mostly made of people like that. Patient wardens, careful judges, a rancher filing a complaint because the law was there to protect him. Nobody writes ballads about a well-run roadblock. But that's what accountability actually looks like, right up until the moment that somebody decides they won't accept it. One last thing, because I don't want to leave the Depression-era morality question hanging as a vibe. Half this basin ate Earl's poached elk. Were they wrong? I'm aware that I'm grading my own grandparents' generation here. So take that for what it's worth, and you're welcome to argue with every word of it. The families who took that meat were feeding their children in the worst economic disaster in American history. And I will not sit in a warm studio and condemn them. The conservation laws that Earl broke were also right, genuinely right, proven right by every elk herd in Wyoming today. And both of those things being true at once is not a contradiction. It's the actual texture of that decade. Survival and law were in tension all over this country in the 30s. And mostly that tension resolved quietly. A warden looked the other way at a widow's woodpile. A judge kept a fine small. A poacher took only what a family needed. The system bent humanely in 1,000 small places. What it could not do was bend for a man who rejected the system's right to exist. That's the line that Earl was standing on long before March of 1939. Not hungry family poaching. The wardens of that area understood hungry family poaching. Total refusal. No license ever. On principle. In the next episode, we're going to watch what happens when a man like that is asked to accept the one thing his entire life was organized around refusing: confinement. In episode 2, the jailbreak, the farmhouse, and the night this stopped being a story about elk. Before the tribute, let's do what we'll do every episode. Name what we don't know. 4 open questions that I'm carrying out tonight. 1, why did Earl jump from the truck? Instinct in the moment or a decision made long before? The record can't say. 2, what did he intend during those 24 hours alone? Deeper wilderness or no plan at all? Locked room. 3, did he understand when he shot that rancher's animal that he was converting a misdemeanor into a felony? Or did he find that out in a cell in Cody? Again, unknown. And question number 4, the one that hangs over everything else, was there any version of Wyoming law enforcement in 1939, any charge, any sentence that Earl Durand would have peacefully accepted? Or had that question been answered years before anyone set up a roadblock? I'm not going to pretend to answer those, but keep them with you because next episode, some of them get answered in the worst possible way. Now, before we leave tonight, there's one more thing to do, and it's the reason that this show exists. We've spent this episode trying to understand Earl Durand, the man, the mythology, the Wyoming that shaped him. And we ended tonight in that still moment, March 14th, 1939, when no one had yet been killed. But you know, and I know, that the stillness doesn't last. Every story that we tell on this show ultimately comes back to the people whose lives were taken. Over these 3 episodes, we're going to remember each of them. Tonight, we begin with 2 Wyoming peace officers who answered a call they could never have known would be their last. These men were not names in a newspaper. They were fathers, husbands, friends, public servants who walked toward danger because protecting their communities was their job. And their stories deserve to be remembered every bit as much as Earl Durand's. Deputy Sheriff D.M. Baker and Town Marshal Chuck Lewis. This is Where the Light Begins by the J.J. Hawk Band. And this is Deputy Sheriff D.M. Baker and Town Marshal Chuck Lewis. D.M. Baker was a deputy sheriff of Park County, Wyoming. He was 69 years old. 69, think about that. This was a man who'd earned the right many times over to be sitting by a stove somewhere, and instead, he was still carrying a badge for his neighbors. A longtime resident of the Big Horn Basin, known across the county as dependable, experienced, the kind of steady, unglamorous lawman that small Wyoming communities have always run on. He served well past the age when most men would have set the work down because the work still needed doing. And because when a difficult call came, D.M. Baker was a man who answered it without hesitation. His death reminds us of something that we'll return to all season. Behind every badge is a person, someone who leaves behind family and friends and an empty place at the table. Chuck Lewis was the town marshal of Powell. He was a veteran of the First World War, a man who'd already served his country once and came home to spend the rest of his life serving his town. He was a husband, a father, and in a community the size of Powell, the marshal isn't a distant figure. Everyone knew Chuck Lewis. He believed in the kind of law enforcement where neighbors solve problems together, where the marshal knows your name and you know his. And that is what makes his story almost unbearable, because Chuck Lewis knew Earl Durand. By multiple accounts, the two men were friends. Their lives had crossed long before March of 1939. When the moment came, this was not a confrontation between strangers. Perhaps that's the greatest tragedy carried inside this whole legend. It wasn't faceless. None of it was faceless. History remembers Earl Durand because his story became legend, but legends cast long shadows. And for 90 years, two names have stood in that shadow that deserve to be spoken just as often. Deputy Sheriff D.M. Baker, Town Marshal Chuck Lewis. Their service mattered, their lives mattered, and their families carried the weight of that loss long after the headlines disappeared. As this series continues, we'll also remember Arthur Argento, Orville Linneberry, and John Gothrop, because every victim deserves more than a passing mention in someone else's story. May we never remember the legend more clearly than we remember the lives that it changed.
If the world forgets our song,